to get a white settlement and maybe push out the Native American settlements, which they did. So they thought if they gave the women a vote, they would come and they would marry the men and their settlement would begin. And it did.
In 1894, 600,000 signatures were presented to the New York State Constitutional Convention, but women's suffrage failed for that too. Women in the suffrage movement wore a variety of clothing, including usually white dresses, boots, and assorted colors, usually purple, gold, and white. Their fashion choices were carefully chosen to gain public support and reflect their changing roles. So white symbolized purity, purple represented the loyalty, and gold symbolized the light of life. In 1895, Elizabeth Cady Stanton published the Women's Bible. After its publication, the NAWSA moves to distance itself from Stanton because many conservative suffragists considered her to be far too radical and thus potentially damaging their campaign. This is Frances Willard. She supported women's suffrage. She also encouraged local efforts to achieve the vote. She convinced women to support suffrage so they could make their own towns dry. Of course, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she believed that women should be able to vote prohibition into law. So this is Mary Terrell, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Frances E.W. Harper, among others. They founded the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which supported women's suffrage.
Several years ago, when I was on a trip to the Southwest, a lady was called Ruth Rolfe. And just in conversation, she mentioned she had written a couple books. Well, one I found and ordered was on baseball, and the other one was a book about Ida B. Wells Barnett. Ida B. Wells, A Woman of Courage. I haven't read it, but I skimmed through it, but I was surprised to find this in what it fits in our presentation. But she was an amazing woman. She was, and again, it was her parents. They encouraged her and educated her from very young. So maybe I will read it now, but it just fit in.
That's it. And so in 1896, Idaho became the next one to allow women to vote. In 1903, Mary Dreyer, Retta Child Dora, Lenora O'Reilly, and others formed the Women's Trade Union in New York, an organization of middle and working class women dedicated to unionization of working women and to women's suffrage. Clara Bard Field was an American poet, a suffragist, a free love advocate, a Georgist, and a Christian socialist. She worked on successful campaigns, suffrage in Oregon and Nevada. So in 1907, the Men's League for Women's Suffrage was formed to provide an organization for the men to rally around. Many of the men who joined this league were the husbands, the brothers, the sons of the women involved in this movement. And in 1910, Washington State adopts women's suffrage. The Women's Political Union organizes for the first suffrage parade in New York City. So in 1912, women's suffrage is supported for the first time at the national level by a major political party, and that was Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. 20,000 suffrage supporters joined a New York suffrage parade. And then Kansas and Arizona adopted suffrage. And if you'll notice here, this is one of the parades in Washington, D.C., and the woman with the breastplate to show that she's a warrior a Roman warrior for women's suffrage. And if you'll remember, in the very first one we had the play, one of the women in that play wore a breastplate because of this picture. In 1913, suffrage organized a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. The parade was the first major suffrage spectacle organized by the National American Women's Suffrage. The two women then organized the Congressional Union, later known as the National Women's Party, and they borrowed strategies from the Radical Women's Social and Political Union, another association. And I think we mentioned this before, Montana and Nevada accept women's suffrage. The National Confederation of Women's Clubs, which had over 2 million women members throughout the United States, formally endorsed women's suffrage. This is Mrs. Arthur Dodge, who opposed women's suffrage. So the National Organization Opposed to Women's Suffrage is organized by Mrs. Dodge. Its members were wealthy women, influential women, Catholic clergy, distillers, brewers, urban political machines, Southern congressmen, and corporate capitalists, of course. 1915, Mabel Werner and Barbara Barfield are involved in a transcontinental tour which gathered over 500,000 signatures on petitions in Congress. 40,000 people marched in a New York City suffrage parade, and many of their women were dressed in white, and they carried placards with their state that they represented. And now Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts reject women's suffrage. Jeanette Rankin of Montana is the first woman ever elected to the House of Representatives. Woodrow Wilson states that the Democratic Party platform will support suffrage. Now this is Doris Day, and she was described by her fellow suffragists as a frail little girl, and yet on the night of November 14th in 1917, prison guards at a workhouse did not hold back after she and 32 other women were arrested and several days earlier having picketed outside the White House. The two men handling her were twisting her arms above her head, and suddenly they lifted her and banged her head down onto an iron bench, twice, recalled the 73-year-old Mary Nolan, who was also one of the prisoners. As members of the National Women's Party, the women and their fellow silent sentinels had been peacefully demonstrating in the nation's capital for months. They were holding banners and placards calling on Woodrow Wilson to back a federal amendment that would give U.S. women the right to vote. And now these 33 women would endure the most harrowing night in the long history of women's suffrage. Never was there a sentence like ours for an offense such as ours. Even in England, they wrote. In 1917, New York women gained suffrage. Nebraska women gained suffrage. Arkansas, women are allowed to vote only in primaries. The National Women's Party picketers appear in front of the White House holding two banners, and they said, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? And how long must women wait for liberty?" Alice Paul, leader of the National Women's Party, was put in solitary confinement in the mental ward of the prisoner as a way to break her will and to undermine her credibility in the public. In June, arrests of the National Women's Party picketers began on charges of obstructing sidewalk traffic. Subsequent picketers are sentenced up to 6 months in jail. In November, the government unconditionally released the picketers in response to the public outcry and in their inability to stop the National Picketers' hunger strike. I have one more thing to say. Representative Rankin opened a debate on women's suffrage in the House, and the amendment failed again. Michigan, South Dakota, and Oklahoma adopt suffrage. and President Woodrow Wilson said he would support suffrage. Go ahead.
I'd like to introduce you to some of the leaders in Iowa and Nebraska. Some you may have heard of, some not. And this information I had clipped in, I think it was 1995, the World Herald at election time ran an article on prominent Nebraska suffragists. First, we have Carrie
Chapman.
Okay, Carrie Chapman Catt, and she was a successor to Susan B. Anthony in her quest for suffrage, and she was the one to show her place and her importance. She received a call from the State Department when the final state, Tennessee, ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920. She grew up in Charles City, Iowa, and she was valedictorian of her class at Iowa State University and superintendent of Mason City Schools. She devoted 60 years to suffrage and world peace. And at his convention in 1900, Susan B. Anthony, then 80, chose Mrs. Catt as her presidential successor. Amelia Jenks Bloomer, she was born in New York, lived in Council Bluffs most of her life, and her name is immortalized in the ankle-length, you can see that picture, the ankle-length pants and tunic that she adopted for a time, which was called bloomers. Maybe it still is. But she was better known in her day for her Votes for Women drive in Iowa. And her temperance newspaper was the first to be owned, operated, and edited by a woman for women. And the epitaph on her tombstone in Fairview Cemetery in the Bluffs reads, "Pioneer of Women's Emancipation." And I've been to that cemetery a number of times to see the black angel that is there, but next time I'll have to look for her tombstone. And some of the Nebraska leaders in the suffrage campaign were Mary Rogers Kimball. She lived in Omaha nearly 60 years. She was the wife of the president of the Union Pacific. And she said, "Government is just like a sponge cake. If an ingredient in a cake is left out, the result isn't good. If any part of people is unrepresented in the government, it is incomplete. I've been a suffragist all my life, and no one can bake a better cake than I can." And she founded the creche in 1887, and this was a boarding and day home for children who are orphaned or whose mothers are employed during the day. In a World Herald story it said, "The creche was said to offer shelter to about 400 little ones each year at a minimum cost to the mother, or for nothing if no money is available." Her son, you may have heard of, Thomas Kimball, he was an architect who designed many of the buildings in Omaha, including St. Cecilia's Cathedral, the original library, but they did not tear it down when they built a new ugly one. But the building still stands just about a block from the Douglas County Courthouse. Clairvaux Dorothy B. Rick Colby was an author, editor, and lecturer who lived in Beatrice. And if you go to Beatrice, you're bound to see some reference to her accomplishments. And she championed the cause of feminism and women's suffrage for 40 years. She founded and edited the longest-lived feminist newspaper in the country. She helped establish a free public library and brought many guest-speaking suffragists to Beatrice. And she died at age 70, like so many, without the right to vote. Retha Child Dorr, we did mention, she was an Omaha native, nationally famous journalist and feminist. She met John Dorr in 1892, married him, but she found him unsympathetic to her need for self-expression and left him and took her 2-year-old son and moved to New York. And she became editor of the women's section of the New York Evening Post, exposing the poor conditions of working women. And she was head of many national organizations. Now, Esther Griswold Warner, This lady was certainly an exception in her role as a suffragist. She was a pioneer farmer who raised her family almost single-handedly, but took a role in the suffrage. She was born on an Ohio farm. She married William Griswold, who died 4 years later. Her second husband, Dr. Amos Warner, was killed in an accident in Iowa. 5 of her 9 children died of illness. Mrs. Warner packed up her children, 2 nephews, and a brother, and set out for Nebraska territory. She homesteaded near Roca, and she often addressed the Nebraska legislature. Margaretta Dietrich lived in Hastings and was the first state president of the Nebraska League of Voters. In 1909, she married a U.S. senator and former Nebraska governor, Charles Henry Dietrich. Elizabeth Griffin Abbott, now the Abbott name is pretty well known if you know Nebraska history. She was a pioneer teacher and mother, very active in civic affairs. The daughter of Quakers and abolitionists, she moved to Grand Island in 1873 as the bride of a lawyer and state legislature, Orthman Abbott. Her 2 daughters carried on the tradition, and you may have heard of them. Grace Abbott worked in immigration, children's welfare at the Hall House in Chicago, and headed several federal positions. She is in the Nebraska Hall of Fame in the Capitol. And you can see her bust along with, I don't know how many, 30, 40 others. Her sister Edith was the first woman dean of a graduate school at an American university. Ada Cole Bittenbender, she was the first woman lawyer in Nebraska and the 3rd woman in the nation to argue cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Sarah Theodosia Vera, an educator, speaker, author, civic leader. She was one of the first 3 women elected to the Nebraska legislature and the first woman to head a legislative committee. She said, "I seem to have been born with a desire to vote and work for it all her life." Now here's a couple, Susan LaFlèche-Bacot. These 2 ladies are 2 of my favorite people from Nebraska. She was the youngest daughter of Joseph Iron Eye LaFlèche Jr., chief of the Omaha tribe, from 1853 to 1864. She left the reservation to study at Women's Medical College in Philadelphia. In 1889, she became the first Indian woman to receive a medical degree, but she came back to the reservation and eventually settling in Wall Hill. And she was a leader there for more than 25 years, campaigned for sanitation and against alcohol. And a small hospital was built in her name, and it was used as a hospital until 1940. And then it had other uses and became kind of, was pretty much run down. But a new hospital or a new medical center is being built, and it's almost finished. It's not just a medical center, it will have programs for youth, a medical clinic. So her name will live on in that clinic. Her sister, Suzette LaFlèche-Tibbles, had a nickname Bright Eyes, and she attended a Presbyterian mission school on the reservation, and then the Elizabeth, New Jersey Institute for Young Ladies. She returned to the reservation again, as her sister did, to teach. In 1881, she married newspaperman Thomas H. Tibbles of the World Herald. And she went with him on a national tour publicizing wrongs committed against the Ponca Indians and their chief, Standing Bear. And Mr. Tibbles he was not the attorney for Standing Bear, but he was behind the scenes and found the attorneys, and of course they won the case. And if you've read the book, I Am a Man, Joel Sarita, it's very good and tells about this long stand. And the lectures resulted in the passage of the Dawes Act, Progressive Indian Rights. And our last one is Doris Stevens. And she was born and educated in Omaha. And she went to Oberlin College, which was the first American college to admit women and blacks. And she graduated and she combined teaching with suffrage and writing. Among her political writings, Jailed for Freedom, and this is from the library. This book included Miss Stevens' first meeting with Ellis. Paul is in this. And she was, as Sandra said, among the women who were arrested and sentenced in August of 1917 for protesting Woodrow Wilson's failure to secure the suffrage for American women. And I think that picture on the front is from that, that they were campaigning, picketing. And this book is also in the library, Failure is Impossible by Susan B. Anthony.
And then, after 128 years, August 26, 1920, 3/4 of the state legislature ratified the 19th Amendment, and so American women win their full voting rights. However, property rights was never discussed for women at that time. So here's a map that shows when each state decided to give women the vote. And the blue ones, you'll see that, first of all, Wyoming 1869 was the very first one. And the blue ones are all those which allowed women to vote before it was the 19th Amendment. But this little row down here with the red dots, those are the ones that were forced to allow women to vote by the 19th Amendment. And so we look at this and we think, well, why is there such a little pattern there? It's in the South and right up the East Coast. And I go back to Sojourner Truth's words, where these men